Hello fear seekers, and welcome back to the channel. Unless you live in a big city, I'm sure most of you drive regularly. At the very least, I think it's safe to assume you've been in a car. But have you ever encountered something you couldn't quite explain while on the road? Today, we're going to be diving into some disturbing, allegedly true, paranormal driving horror stories. Now, it is a dream of mine to read subscriber horror stories someday. With that in mind, I'd ask that you subscribe to the channel and like the video so we can make that happen together. If you have any scary stories from your own life that you'd like to share, submit them to the email in the description. I would be honored to read them. Now without further ado, sit back, keep your eyes on the road, and get ready to ferment your fears. Okay, so I've never particularly considered myself a believer of the paranormal, nor am I a complete skeptic. I mean, I turn all the lights on to go to the toilet if I've watched a scary film or been reading some decent paranormal stories, so I must believe, at least to an extent. A bit of backstory. My dad lives in the Scottish Highlands, has done so for the last 20 plus years, and I drive the 14-hour round trip to visit as often as possible, 2 to 3 times a year. I've always loved this journey, especially if I'm by myself, as there's around 2 to 3 hours of motorway, followed by back roads through the mountains, through forests and around lochs where I can put music on and pretty much just switch off. For the most part, there's little to no phone signal, so I generally download a couple of playlists before I go, pop my phone in its holder and blindly follow the sat-nav until it loses signal. I've been doing this journey for years, so really I have no requirement for the sat-nav, but I love to try and beat the ETA. It can also be quite handy, when it has signal, to let me know if there are any accidents or diversions ahead. Anyhow, on this particular journey I was coming home. I'd set off at nightfall as there's far less traffic on the overnight journeys and less chance to get stuck behind holiday makers, especially caravans. I effing hate caravans. I was traveling south in January and the weather was something else. My car showed an outside temperature of -12 degrees Celsius, 10 Fahrenheit, and the snow barely stopped. It hadn't stopped since I arrived at my dad's house 4 days earlier. My wipers were on full speed, but still the snow kept piling up on my windscreen, meaning I had to drive around half my usual speed. Every now and then there'd be a short break in the snowfall and everything just looked magical. It was like driving through a Christmas card. Looking down into the valleys, everything covered in a thick white blanket and lit up by the dim glow of the overhead moon, making it possible to still make out the river weaving its way through the cracks in the deepest crevices, reflecting what little light there was. On these roads, there's nothing in terms of lighting, and what's worse is there can quite often be a large drop on either side of the road. Couple this with 3 to 4 feet of fresh snowfall and an inability to see any of the road, and you've got the potential of a lot of accidents. In order to combat this, there's 8-foot-high sticks at the sides of the road with reflective tape at the top, red on one side and white on the other. Drive between these and you should be okay. So, I was driving and driving. The snow just hadn't given up and I was focusing on the red and white reflective tape to keep on the road. Up ahead I saw the dim taillights of another car, a welcome sight as it was the first I'd seen in over an hour. Everyone else must have known that it was a bad idea to be out in this. Instead of focusing on the reflective sticks, I was now focusing on the taillights of the car ahead. I couldn't quite work out what make or model it was. A lightish white or light gray SUV of some sort, holiday makers. I thought this because I could make out their roof box and bike rack. They too must have ignored the warnings to not drive tonight. When I sped up to try and make some ground between us, it seemed to speed up too. If I slowed down, they slowed down too. The space between us remained a constant. I decided that my headlights must have been annoying them in their rearview mirror, so kept the distance as it was, blindly following their lights whilst being mindful to try and keep my tires in the most shallow bits of snow on the road, avoiding the occasional snow mound. A bit of time elapsed, and I have no idea how much, as I'd now switched off entirely, listening to my mix of 90s old school dance, the howl of the wind and splat of snow on my windscreen, and, in between wiper switches, watching the red lights ahead of me, glowing in the dark like the eyes of a demonic beast, intent on keeping its distance. I'm very aware that I'm getting carried away writing this, but it's been a while since I actually wrote anything other than the daily emails to clients and customers. It's quite nice to be able to put my memories down in a physical format. I noticed the car ahead start to take a turn off the road and felt a sudden sense of sadness and loneliness. I was losing my traveling buddy. The only other sign of human life I'd had for the last few hours. I then realized that, having been so intent on following the car in front, I had no idea where I was, which isn't an issue. I essentially just had to stay on the same road for 3 hours until I reached a fork in the road, turn right and then onto the main road and see a little roundabout. Bizarrely though, my sat-nav now just displayed lost GPS signal and had me as a dot on a white background, convenient as everything was covered in snow. It never did this. It had usually downloaded enough of the route to at least keep the map on screen. It was then I got an overwhelming urge to follow the car ahead. I knew I shouldn't. I literally had no turnings I needed to make off the road, and I really didn't recognize the road they were taking, and, the more I think of it, I've never noticed a turnoff that goes down the side of the mountain like this did, but maybe I'd just never looked. I decided to follow it. Of course I did. If I ever think I shouldn't do something because it could end up in regret, I'll probably do it. Although, as I neared the turning, I started to doubt myself and thought I should stay on my road, but no matter how much I wanted to keep the wheels going straight, my hands and body wouldn't allow it. I turned off. I didn't recognize this new road. I didn't recognize my old road when I was on that either, so it really made no difference. Everything was white. Everything was dark. Lots of trees and the reflective sticks. If anything, it looked exactly the same, like I hadn't turned off at all. 10 to 15 minutes later, the car ahead started pulling away from me. Only slowly, but faster than I wanted to drive in these conditions, so I let it. It couldn't really get away anyway, as there was nowhere to go from this road, so I figured I'd see it again shortly. Another 10 minutes or so passed of driving alone, and then, in the distance, I spotted lights again, and this time I was catching up quickly. The lights were flashing in the dark distance. Amber, nothing. Amber, nothing. Great. My travel buddy has got their hazard lights on and they've stopped. I decided I'd have to pull over and see what was wrong. As I pulled up behind my buddy, a white Audi, possibly a Q3 or Q5, I'm not sure, I noticed the amount of snow on their car. Surely far too much for them to have just stopped. And there were no tire tracks for me to pull into. But it was 100% the same car I'd been following. I came to a stop just as a woman in a big blue coat ran to my window waving her arms. I'm not the most empathetic of people, but it didn't take much to read the relief on her face and see that she'd been crying. She'd had to pull over because she'd had a puncture and then explained she'd been waiting there, unable to call anyone as there's no signal, and thought she'd have to wait until the morning before she could leave. She'd had her ignition on, while she listened to music and tried to keep the DVD player running for her little one, pressing the heated seat button each time it turned itself off, until it wouldn't come back on. Her battery had died. I thought she was being a bit dramatic. It was literally only a few minutes since she'd pulled away from me. She can't have been here long. Over 4.5 hours. That's how long she said they'd been there. Over 4.5 hours sat in her car with her 18-month-old child in -12-degree temperatures with no phone signal, food or drink, and no way to heat the inside of the car up. So this wasn't the car in front of me for the last 2 hours, but it looked exactly the same, even down to the dark gray roof box and bike rack. Coincidence? A big one, but that's all I can logically think. I suddenly felt angry. Angry that the car in front of me hadn't stopped to help. Maybe they thought I would? That's a bit presumptuous of them. I'd asked if she'd tried to flag them down. A look of confusion or concern spread across her face. She told me there hadn't been a single car go past while she'd been there. But I stopped myself from going any further, from explaining that I'd been following a car that didn't exist for over 2 hours. She was scared enough, for being sat here in the dark for the last few hours. I jumped out and looked in her car, assisted by the light from my headlights. I saw her little one was fast asleep. I asked her if she wanted some coffee from my flask. She said yes. I knelt down in the snow. She'd already tried removing the nuts and had left the wrench on the floor, next to the wheel. It was covered in a layer of snow and freezing cold. I jacked up her car, removed her tire, and replaced it with the pitiful space saver from the boot. I lit a smoke and pulled my car next to hers, connected the batteries, and instructed her to start up her car. Once it came back to life, we stood and spoke. Asked her where she was going. "Sterling," she replied. "Brilliant. I'll follow behind you." Again, I thought. That's on my route. She thanked me for helping her, for talking to her, and for calming her down. She thanked me for the coffee and gave me a quick hug. Quick enough to be meaningful, short enough to not be overly awkward from a stranger. She got in her car and set off. I got in my car. I sat for a moment, staring at the all-too-familiar taillights of the white-grayish SUV with a roof box and bike rack, lit up a smoke and set off. I sped up. I caught her up. I slowed down. She pulled away. Her speed remained a constant. I kept wondering how she hadn't seen the other car that was exactly the same as her car. I kept wondering how I now knew where we were, but yet we'd not turned off, or turned on, to any other roads. As we neared the civilization of the A-roads, I started to become aware of the tracks left by my new travel buddy. The tracks in the snow, left by their tires. The tracks in the snow that I'm 99% certain weren't there when I was following her, or the other her, before I stopped and offered her coffee. The snow eased as we entered a town called Kilmahog. We reached a junction, and she turned right. I turned right. We were now driving in sleet, wet snow that leaves a dirty gray and brown slush on the ground. Wet snow that makes seeing much harder than normal dry snow. As we approached the roundabout, she indicated left for the first turning. I indicated right for the last and pulled alongside her. She looked, waved goodbye, and left. Someone, or rather something, took me that way that night, diverted from my normal route, made me feel as though I had no other option but to follow that car, guided me to a stranded woman and her child, in freezing conditions with no food, water, or heating. I'm still unsure how to explain it. I've not really thought about it too much. I don't like not being able to understand things or give them a logical explanation. It makes me feel uneasy. I certainly never thought too much about the paranormal. I've always presumed that the paranormal was real, it would present itself to me if it needed to. If not, I'd live in blissful ignorance. But now I don't know, and, to me, that's worse than knowing. A friend of mine told me this story about a girl she met from Sweden who was staying with her as a couch surfer. The girl was in her mid-20s, and while my friend told me her name, I never remembered it. just the content of this horrific story that will never leave my mind. So this girl, let's call her Jane, was driving to her mother's house. They lived far out of the city and in a highly forested area. There were no streetlights and not a lot of houses. If there were houses, they were built back into the forest with long winding driveways before any sign of life. So, Jane was a late teenager driving back to her mother's home in the late evening. As she was driving, something up ahead on the road caught her eye. It was a small bundle next to the road, and as her car passed the bundle, she was shocked. It looked like a baby wrapped up in a blanket. Jane smashed the brakes, stopping 50 meters up the road. She reversed back a little and then jumped out of the car as quick as she could, thinking that someone had abandoned a baby on the side of the road. Jane ran over to the bundled up blanket and exhaled a sigh of relief. It was just a toy baby. Just as she had picked up the baby, she saw headlights coming down the road in front of her. Suddenly realizing she was standing on the road alone at night, she ran quickly back to her car and jumped in, chucking on the engine and driving off. The car behind her sped up, coming up really close to the back of her car, tooting its horn at her. Jane was panicking. She started driving faster and faster, constantly checking her rearview mirror. Although she couldn't see who was in the car behind her, she was still terrified. Eventually, she reached her mother's driveway, which was still about 2 kilometers long. Her mother lived deep into the forest. She thought to herself that if the car followed her down the driveway, she would call her mother and tell her to ring the police, and as she turned onto the driveway, the car behind her also turned into the driveway, still very close behind her. I remember part of the story was that she kept thinking back to the baby toy and how creepy the evening had been. Jane got out her phone and called her mother. She told her she was being followed and to call the police. She was expected to arrive in about 5 minutes. The car was still following very close, and both cars were going way too fast for the type of road and for no streetlights. Jane could see nothing but what was being lit by her headlights and the headlights of her pursuer. Then she saw her mother's house in the distance of her headlights, the pursuer still very close behind her, still beeping the horn so loudly Jane's ears rang. As she got to the house, she jumped out of the car. Her mother was standing at the front of the house waiting for her with a kitchen knife in her hand. Jane ran up to her as quickly as she could. The car that was following her also stopped and the doors of the car flew open. An elderly couple jumped out of the car and were yelling and pointing to Jane's car. "Someone got into your car!" they screamed. As Jane was realizing what had happened, a man jumped out of the back seat of her car and ran into the forest. Everyone just looked at each other in shock as Jane realized what had just happened. The car coming down the road had seen someone jump into her car when she stopped to check the baby. It was most likely they had left it there on the road watching for people to stop, taking advantage of people's kindness. As I said at the start of this post, a friend of mine told me this story, and I believe it to be true. If anyone else has heard of this, please leave a comment. I don't believe it was the guy's first time trying this. Always lock your doors when you get out of your car. I absolutely want to make it clear that this is true. My wife and I both witnessed this and will never forget what we saw last night. I am a 43-year-old man, a former Marine with a lot of time at sea, and a former railroader. So, I have been to a lot of places that are just hard to get to for most folks. I have never seen anything like what we saw last night, and it happened on Highway 50 in between Penrose and Pueblo, Colorado. My wife was working a closing shift in Cannon City last night. I left Pueblo and made the drive west as usual. After she clocked out, she went to pick up our son from his job, only to find he wasn't working last night. On the drive back from Cannon, you pass Penrose, and then there is a place I have always called the Big Hole. The big hole is actually called Pierce Gulch. There is a significant drop in elevation and then you immediately climb back out, hence my nickname. As we were approaching Big Hole at about 12:40 a.m., something, traveling from north to south, crossed all 4 lanes and median of Highway 50 at an incredible rate of speed. We were the only vehicle out there at this time of night and we nearly hit it. It was roughly 3 feet tall and had long brown hair everywhere. And again, this thing was hauling ass. Faster than any animal I had ever seen or heard of. My wife was driving and had our son on speakerphone. She started and looked at me and asked, "What the hell was that?" By this time we were down in the bottom of the gulch and headed back uphill. We told our son what we saw and she got off the call. We discussed it for a second and decided to go back and see if maybe it had gotten caught in the barbed wire fence or something. Maybe there was some trace of this thing. We both were amazed by how fast it was moving. By 12:45 we had traveled back to the west side of the gulch and turned around. There wasn't any traffic, so my wife just slowly rolled down the shoulder of the highway and I had my window down and was shining a flashlight that I had in the car into the field. There isn't much out there except cactus and stuff. As we came up on the approximate area we saw this thing, I told my wife, "Hey, look, do you see those eyes?" She said yes and stopped the car. 10 yards or so on the other side of the fence was a pair of very bright, very blue eyes. Not far off the ground. I was thinking we probably were looking at a coyote or something. It was looking directly back at us. What happened next, I will never forget as long as I live. Whatever those eyes belonged to, effing stood up. Like a man. Like a 6.5 to 7 foot tall man. They were still looking at us. Whatever it was that flew across the road at like Mach 2, this was it. This was the hairy thing we saw. There was a moment of disbelief and shock. And then as it registered that we found the thing and it wasn't just some animal, the fear kicked in. I told my wife, "Go, go, go!" It seemed like slow motion. She floored the gas and the thing watched us leave. We already knew that this thing was incredibly fast. So she drove as fast as she could and out of the gulch, and I was looking out the back window and checking mirrors. My wife was afraid it might be following us. It wasn't, and I didn't want to make things worse by admitting that I was worried too. We drove very fast for several minutes. We talked, but it was like we were each talking to ourselves. Like, "Oh my god, what the hell was that? And was it waiting for us?" Soon the lights from Pueblo west were ahead, and we were back in civilization. Once we got into the city, we finally started to relax a little. We talked until we got home and then checked the car for anything. We couldn't really go to sleep for hours. My wife got online and was searching for anything that matched the creature we saw. She found some stories, paranormal in nature, of other people witnessing a creature that sounded exactly like the one we had seen. She has to work the same shift tonight. So on our way out of Cannon City, we are going to stop and go out into the field where we saw the thing and see if there is any evidence. Footprints or hair. Something. I will update this if I find something unusual. I drive a lot. My commute from home to work or school is about 30 to 45 minutes every day since I live in rural Kansas. Not to mention all my friends and my girlfriend live in the city, which is about another 30 minutes north. I don't mind it though. Living in the country is worth all of that. Knowing me, one wouldn't think that I like living in the country, but I've always felt safe in the isolation, and the silence is quite peaceful. Driving that much gives me a lot of time to think. Even though I'm extremely busy all the time with work and school, I still get about an hour a day alone in the silence of my car with my thoughts. Sometimes I think about interesting things that help the commute seem shorter. Other times the drive seems to drag on for what feels like forever. This was one of those times. I was driving home late one night after a rather long shift at the grocery store I work at. I was exhausted. Waking up at 8 a.m. and going to school for 6 hours, then immediately busting my ass at work for 8 hours really takes a toll on me both mentally and physically. But I'm used to it. This is what being a responsible adult is all about, right? Either way, I couldn't wait to get home and crawl into bed and drift off to sleep. One of the things I usually do to help pass the time on the way home is call my girlfriend. We usually have pretty interesting conversations that make us both laugh, and since she lives an hour away from me, it's always nice to hear her voice whenever I have the opportunity. I pick up my phone from the passenger seat and click on her name and call her. She answers with her familiar, "Hello?" and I reply with my usual surprised, "Hey doll." But when I replied that night, she couldn't hear me. After a few minutes of trying to get her to hear me, she eventually hung up. I was okay with that. I would just call her when I got home. I was pretty close anyway. However, it was odd that the connection was bad, even though I live in the middle of nowhere. Cell connection had never been a problem. I continued driving. Nothing was out of the ordinary until I passed the exit of 223rd Street. Usually after that exit, there's a big curve in the highway, and about a quarter mile after that is my exit on 247th Street. But that night, there was no curve. At least I didn't think there was. When you drive a certain way so much, you eventually don't really notice things like that, and I didn't notice it until I was driving for another 20 minutes. Of course, I just spaced out thinking about my girlfriend and missed my exit. It was no problem though. I would just keep driving another 5 miles to the nearest town and turn around there. I kept driving, and driving, and driving. No exit. No town. Nothing. I began to grow worried and confused. Was I on the wrong highway? Did I space out and miss the exit again? No. I took the same way I take every day, and I made sure I would catch the next exit into the town. I was in the middle of nowhere. Complete and total isolation. And since it was late at night, it didn't strike me as odd that there wasn't anyone else out on the roads. Darkness surrounded me from all angles, but I just kept driving. Eventually, I would run into something, right? No. There was nothing. No exits, no curves in the highway, no streetlights, houses, barns, nothing. I even looked up at the sky at one point to locate the moon to see if I was going the right direction, but even the sky was pitch black. My heart began racing as I looked at my phone to call my dad, and I realized I had no service. Crap, I whispered to myself. At this point, I was sweating like a pig and breathing uncontrollably. I was absolutely terrified. That's when my low gas light came on. The ringing almost made me scream, and when I looked down and saw that I had about 10 miles left, my eyes began to fill with tears. I just wanted something. At this point, even a street lamp would have made me jump for joy. Sure enough, after what felt like about 20 minutes of more emptiness, my car began to sputter. I had run out of gas. Words cannot describe how terrified I was. I looked at my phone again to check the time, but as my luck would have it, my phone was dead. After maybe 30 minutes of my car being completely dead, I decided to muster up the courage to walk outside. I opened my car door, but was not greeted by the asphalt on the road I was expecting. Instead, it was something that resembled that of kitchen tiles. I stepped out of my car into the darkness to let my eyes adjust. I stared into the darkness for maybe 3 minutes to no avail. I turned to walk back to my car but couldn't find it. My car was gone. I was in the dark. There was nothing. I couldn't see anything. Black was all I saw. There was no breeze. There was no smell. I couldn't even feel the clothes on my body or my feet touching the ground. There was nothing. I was nothing. I began to lose my sanity. Thoughts of death and suffering flooded my brain. It hurt. It hurt so bad. I wanted to scream, but every time I tried, nothing came out. I suddenly felt an excruciating pain in my abdomen. Something. It was something. It may have been pain, but it was something. I could feel something wet trickling down my face off my eyelids. I began to feel everything around me. I could feel my clothes, the ground. It was all there. Then I could taste, but all I could taste was blood. Then I could see. I could make out flashing red and blue lights from behind my eyelids. Then I could hear. I heard screeching metal and men asking if I was okay. I opened my eyes and tried to speak, but everything hurt. My arms, my legs, my head. Everything. I could feel everything. Some strange men lifted me up onto a stretcher and I turned my head and saw my mangled car in a ditch. They told me I was lucky to be alive. Evidently, I passed out from exhaustion behind the wheel. Thank God. The hell that I had just dove into was nothing but a horrible nightmare. Even though I almost died, I was just happy to be out of that place. Weeks go by and I have made a full recovery. I'm back at work and I feel better than ever. I'm driving home now. I keep trying to call my girlfriend, but I don't have any service. Hey guys, glad to see you made it to the end of the video. I know that second story doesn't necessarily qualify as paranormal, but I felt it needed to be included. Just the idea of someone hiding away in your back seat is horrifying. Have you ever had any strange encounters while driving, human or otherwise? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. As always, if you have any stories that you'd like to be told, be sure to send them in. Alright guys, that just about wraps up the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So long, Fear Seekers. I'll see you in the next video.